Please subscribe. It helps a lot.
I'm not sure if I was born too early or far too late. Snow had begun to gather on the upper ridges of the Alps when I returned home. The castle stood in quiet authority above the lake, its yellow walls holding the warmth of candlelight against the growing winter. I moved through its corridors without company, the sound of my own steps swallowed by tapestries depicting swan knights and maidens in forests, untouched by time. My father loved these stories, though I often wondered if he ever believed in them. For me, belief had never been a choice. I saw them. Visions arrived, as they always had, uninvited and unshakable. At times, I witnessed the centuries before my birth, tournaments in the courtyards, the cries of soldiers dying beneath the banners of long-dead kings. At other moments, I stood in a future so strange, I could scarcely name what I saw. Towers of glass, ships sailing through the sky, voices carried on invisible currents. Each vision settled into my memory with the same weight as lived experience. I could no longer separate them from what others called reality. My father's summons to the autumn hunt had been the reason for my return. The forests stretched dark and vast beyond the castle gates, filled with the smell of pine and frost. I joined the party late in the afternoon, the sun already low. It was there I first saw Paul of Thurn, on taxis, leaning against a post in the hunting lodge with an expression that balanced patience and mischief. His uniform bore no creases, his boots shone, yet his gaze carried something untamed. Introductions in such company usually passed without consequence. Yet the moment we shook hands, I felt an undercurrent I could neither name nor dismiss. He smiled slightly, as though aware of some private truth. The others busied themselves with rifles, dogs, and boasts about the coming season. Paul walked beside me instead, asking questions in a tone that suggested genuine interest rather than formality. That evening the hunters gathered inside the lodge. Silver-gilt cups of steaming wine passed from servant to guest, the air rich with wood smoke and venison roasting on the spit. Paul and I sat apart from the others, near a narrow window where the snow began to fall in slow, deliberate patterns. He asked what occupied my thoughts when I seemed absent from the conversation. I told him about my visions without ceremony, watching his reaction carefully. He tilted his head, the firelight tracing the line of his cheek. "You speak of them as if you've walked through other lives," he said. "In a sense, I have," I replied. "I see what has been, and what will be. I cannot explain why, only that I was born too early, or far too late." He laughed softly, though not in mockery. "If that is true, then you are either cursed, or the most fortunate man alive. Which do you believe? I have not decided." The snow thickened outside, the lodge dimming until only the fire and a few oil lamps lit the room. The others sang hunting songs, voices spilling ale and cheer, yet I remained aware of Paul's nearness, the way his sleeve brushed mine when he shifted, the steadiness in his gaze when the conversation drifted towards silence. We spoke of art, of ancient ruins, of the music both of us admired. His knowledge surprised me, as did his willingness to challenge my thoughts without offence. In the days that followed, we walked along the banks of the Alpsea. The water reflected the pale winter sky, swans gliding across its surface as though carved from the season itself. I told him of a vision I once had of this same lake centuries earlier, where knights in silvered armour crossed a bridge no longer standing. He listened, his hands clasped behind his back, asking questions with a curiosity free of judgment. He warned me, however, that not all ears at court would be so generous. "Bavaria thrives on tradition," he said, glancing toward the distant towers of the castle. "What they cannot understand, they will try to control." We returned to the castle before dusk, the torches already lit along the inner walls. I felt an unfamiliar steadiness beside him, as if my visions were less heavy when shared. That night, alone in my chambers, I sat by the window and watched the snow fall into the dark. Somewhere beyond the trees, a swan called out across the lake, the sound echoing through the still air. In that moment, I saw myself again, crowned, draped in velvet, standing before a window, much like this one, while swans gathered in the mist. I did not know when it would happen, only that it would. Paul's face lingered in my mind as I closed my eyes. The vision remained, even as sleep pulled me under, and I could not tell if what I saw belonged to the past, the future, or the strange current where both seemed to meet. My father's illness moved quickly. I returned from a ride through the gardens to find the castle in a state of subdued urgency, servants moving in hurried silence. The corridors smelled faintly of incense. Courtiers spoke in low voices, their eyes shifting toward me when they thought I could not see. When the news came, it was spoken without preamble. King Maximilian was dead. I stood at the window of my chamber for a long time, the air cold against my face. The Alps lay in solemn stillness beyond the lake. A vision rose before me without warning. I saw a long hall lined with thrones, each occupied by a king whose face shifted between strangers and my own reflection. Behind them came a future I did not recognize, where thrones stood empty in rooms preserved for tourists. The sense of passing through a narrow place in history pressed against me until I could hardly draw breath. 2 days later, I entered Munich as king. The residence loomed in stone and shadow, its halls filled with ministers, clergy, and soldiers. In the audience chamber, the air felt heavy with frankincense. My coronation robe trailed over the marble floor, and the weight of the crown pressed into my temples. The archbishop's voice echoed from the vaulted ceiling, but I heard only fragments of his blessing. The moment the crown touched my head, the visions returned in full force. The city aflame in some distant war, the same city alive with strange lights and roaring machines. After the ceremony, I escaped the crowds and found Paul in a quiet corridor. His presence brought a steadiness I could not summon on my own. He bowed more out of habit than necessity. "It suits you," he said softly, glancing at the crown I still carried in my hands. "I see its end already," I replied. We walked together into the residence library, where tall windows let in the fading light. Shelves rose high against the walls, holding centuries of thought in bound volumes. Paul trailed a hand along the spines as he followed me between the aisles. I told him of the visions I had seen during the ceremony, careful not to speak too loudly. He listened without mockery, his brow furrowed in thought. "You speak of futures no man could imagine," he said at last. "If you truly believe them, they will shape every choice you make." "They already have," I said. In the weeks that followed, my ministers pressed me to enter into alliances I knew would end in calamity. I resisted, speaking of the need for caution, for preservation of Bavaria's independence. Their disapproval grew more visible each time I refused them. I could sense their unease with a young king who preferred the company of artists and philosophers to generals and financiers. Paul remained close during those first months. We dined together in smaller rooms away from the state banquets, the two of us often lingering over maps or illuminated manuscripts while the rest of the court entertained itself. Our hands brushed when we leaned over a table to examine a chart, and I felt the contact with the same clarity as the visions. Gossip grew in the corners of the court. A young king with no queen invited speculation, and my open regard for Paul gave the whisperers their material. Paul warned me one evening as we walked the inner courtyard. "They will not forgive you for being different," he said. "They will tolerate eccentricity in a king, but not intimacy they cannot control." "I am aware," I answered, though my tone carried less conviction than I intended. The swans on the courtyard fountain turned their marble faces toward the falling snow as if listening. At night, I found myself drawn again to the windows of my chambers. The city spread below in its winter quiet. From here, I could almost see the centuries layered over each other. Past kings rode through the gates beneath me. Future streets blazed with light. My reflection in the glass blurred into other faces, other lives. Through it all, Paul's presence gave the visions a shape I could endure. In his company, the burden of seeing what others could not felt less like exile. Yet I knew the forces gathering around me, and that they would try to break every bond they could not command. The first sketches for Neuschwanstein covered the desk in my private study. I leaned over them late into the night, the candles guttering low, ink staining my fingers. Towers climbed toward the edges of the page, bridges arched over valleys, yet untouched by stone. I could see the castle in my mind with greater clarity than the walls around me. It rose from the cliffs like something born from legend, though to me it was neither fantasy nor indulgence. It was a place I had already walked in visions in centuries both past and yet to come. Paul visited during the earliest stages. We rode from the residence through the foothills, following the river toward the site I had chosen. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. Villagers paused their work to watch us pass, the sound of our horses' hooves carrying across the open meadows. When we reached the ridge above the gorge, the river glinted below like a thread of steel in the pale sun. "This is where it will stand," I told him. He stood beside me in silence for a moment, studying the slope, the trees, the wide sweep of mountain beyond. "It will be seen from far away," he said. "It must be," I replied. "The future will expect it." Back in Munich, I summoned Richard Wagner to court. My ministers muttered about the expense, about the scandal attached to his name, but I knew his music belonged to the world I intended to build. When Wagner played for me, the vision shifted into sharper focus. The past came alive in his chords, banquets in candlelit halls, nights riding under moonlight. The future appeared as well, though it was stranger. Vast halls built not of stone, but of glass, where music played from devices with no visible source. I told Paul of these visions while we walked the unfinished galleries of the residence. He listened, the echo of our steps carrying in the high ceilings. "You speak of both history and invention as if they breathed the same air," he said. "They do," I answered. "The stories we tell are the architecture of the future. Without them, there is nothing to build upon." He came with me to the construction site that spring. The first stones lay in rough stacks, the foundations traced in chalk and string. Workmen paused to bow as we passed. Paul took the plans from my hands and studied them with a faint smile. "They call you mad for this?" "They do," I said. "Then they lack imagination." I laughed under my breath. "Number." "They lack the will to see beyond their own comfort. The more I see the truth of the world, the madder they think I am." The months moved quickly, each one bringing new drawings, new decisions. I instructed the artist to paint not only biblical scenes, but the legends of Lohengrin, Parsifal, and the Grail. Ministers objected, calling them distractions from the duties of state. I answered that beauty was a duty, though they refused to hear it. The court watched my closeness with Paul in silence that grew heavier with time. At banquets I felt their eyes on us when we spoke apart from the others. My mother inquired after potential brides with polite persistence. I deflected her questions without irritation, though the pressure curled around me like a tightening cord. In private, Paul seemed less troubled. He leaned against the carved rail of the balcony one evening, looking out over the city's rooftops. "They will speak regardless," he said. "If not about me, then about something else." "I know," I replied, stepping beside him. The night was cool, the streets below lit by scattered lamps. For a moment I saw the city in another time, the same streets filled with lights brighter than fire, the air filled with the hum of unseen power. I could almost hear music from the future woven into the sounds of the present. Paul turned toward me then, his face shadowed but near. We did not speak. The closeness felt like an agreement, though no words sealed it. Work on the castle continued. Each stone placed brought me closer to a vision I could inhabit fully. I moved between that vision and the duties of state with increasing difficulty. When ministers spoke of alliances and budgets, I thought of painted halls filled with music, towers touched by the clouds, and the quiet presence of someone who understood why it all mattered. At night, when I returned to my chambers, I often saw the lake from my dreams, swans drifting in the mist, the silhouette of Neuschwanstein behind them, complete at last. In those moments, I knew I was building something for more than myself. The present resisted me, but the future would not. In the summer of 1866, the air in Munich carried the tension of approaching war. Prussia and Austria moved toward conflict, each seeking influence over the smaller German states. Bavaria stood in a position that demanded a choice. My ministers pressed for alliance with Austria. They spoke of honour, tradition, and the need to stand with our historic partners. I saw the outcome in visions before the first shot was fired. The war would end quickly. Bavaria's armies would bleed in the field. The land would carry the weight of defeat, and with it, dependency on Prussia. I spoke against the alliance in the council chamber, my voice steady, though every man at the table watched me with suspicion. Their loyalty to the old order left no room for what I knew. Paul listened in silence at the edge of the chamber. When the meeting ended, he walked with me through the stone corridors, our steps echoing in the stillness. "You believe the defeat certain," he said. "I have already seen it," I replied. "Then you will be blamed when it comes." The war unfolded as I had foreseen. Bavaria's forces fought with determination, yet our lines broke under Prussian strength. News of losses arrived daily. Streets once filled with music grew quiet. The defeat came with terms that cut into our sovereignty. Ministers who once spoke with confidence now sought ways to limit the damage, but their eyes turned toward me with growing resentment. Paul's place at court became less secure. His presence in my council was questioned by men who never trusted him. Orders arrived, assigning him to a regiment stationed far from Munich. The message was written in polite language, framed as an honour, yet I understood its purpose. We met in the Residenz gardens on the evening before his departure. Linden trees lined the gravel paths, their leaves moving in the light breeze. He wore his uniform, the collar fastened neatly, his hands resting behind his back. "I will miss you," he said. "I know," I answered. Neither of us spoke for a long while. The bells from the cathedral carried across the city. I wanted to tell him that the visions showed him returning, older and marked by the years, but the words felt too heavy. Instead, I stepped closer until the space between us narrowed, to the point where silence carried more weight than speech. When he left the next morning, I stood at a window in the east wing, watching the carriages move through the gate. The city beyond stretched into a haze of summer light. For a moment, I saw him in another time, walking away in a uniform unfamiliar to me. The air filled with the distant sound of machines instead of horses. Then the vision faded, and I was alone. Without Paul, the court felt colder. I attended council meetings, but my thoughts wandered to the castle rising in the mountains. Construction had advanced, the first towers visible above the tree line. I visited often, leaving Munich for days at a time. My ministers began to complain that I neglected affairs of state. I walked the grounds of Neuschwanstein in the early mornings, the mist rising from the gorge. Swans moved along the riverbank without fear. The workers greeted me politely, though I knew many of them considered my presence strange. I spoke with the architects about new designs for the Great Hall, adding more scenes from the legends of Lohengrin. The visions grew sharper. At times, the half-built halls around me would flicker into completion, lit by sunlight through painted windows. At other times, the stonework dissolved into ruins, the place abandoned, yet still beautiful. The boundary between what existed and what might exist blurred until I could not say which world I inhabited. When I returned to Munich, I found the court more distant than before. Conversations ceased when I entered a room. Ministers exchanged notes during meetings, their eyes avoiding mine. My mother spoke to me with the careful tone she used for subjects she wished to control. One evening, I walked the palace corridors alone. The tapestries along the walls showed knights in armour, their faces turned toward unseen horizons. I felt the same pull they seemed to follow. I knew the court considered me distracted, perhaps unstable, yet the visions gave me a clarity I could not surrender. The night ended with me at my desk, looking over the plans for Neuschwanstein. Candlelight traced the lines of towers and walls. In the quiet, I imagined the sound of footsteps approaching from behind. When I turned, there was no one there, only the faint sense of presence that sometimes came before a vision. The lake appeared in my mind, mist curling along its surface, swans drifting near the shore. I saw the castle completed above it, its windows lit against the night. In that moment, I understood I would see it finished, no matter what the court tried to take from me. By the winter of 1870, the name they whispered behind closed doors was no longer Ludwig. It had become something colder, spoken with a mix of pity and mockery. The fairy tale king. The name clung to me in the way frost clings to the window panes of the residence, sharp and impossible to ignore. The Franco-Prussian War had drawn Bavaria into the orbit of the German Empire. Ministers praised the victory that brought us under Prussian rule, though they avoided looking at me as they did so. I saw the truth in the visions, the loss of our independence, the tightening of invisible chains. My voice carried no weight in council anymore. I began to speak less, though the silence made them more uneasy than my words. I withdrew from Munich whenever I could. Neuschwanstein rose higher against the mountains, each visit revealing progress. The workers moved like ants across the scaffolding, their hammers carrying through the thin air. Inside, the walls began to hold the first scenes of Lohengrin, painted in deep colours that pulled at my chest. I stood in those halls for hours, the smell of fresh plaster mixing with cold stone, and I felt as though I were breathing in a world that belonged to me alone. Paul had returned to Bavaria the year before, but his station kept him far from court. We met in secret, usually at the castle, far from the eyes of ministers. His hair had grown longer, his shoulders broader. He spoke less than before, but when our eyes met, there was no mistaking the recognition between us. Once, we stood together in the still unfinished throne room, the night air coming in through an open arch. Snow drifted across the floor. I told him of a vision in which he stood beside me years from now. Both of us older, the castle complete, the air filled with music from unseen sources. "And if it is true," he asked, "what will it have cost you?" I could not answer. The court's resentment deepened. Rumours spread about my spending, my long absences, my interest in unnatural friendships. The newspapers hinted at extravagance, at a king lost in dreams. My ministers visited me less often, preferring to send letters written in precise, bloodless language. I found peace in solitude, though solitude began to consume me. In the still hours of night, I walked through the palace without a lamp, the corridors lit faintly by moonlight. Shadows shifted at the edges of my vision. Sometimes I followed them, certain I would find someone I knew, but they always slipped beyond my reach. One evening, I returned from Neuschwanstein to find my apartments colder than usual. On my desk lay a note in Paul's hand, its ink hurried and uneven. He wrote of being reassigned, this time to a location he could not name. I read the words again and again until the candle burned low. For weeks after, I carried his absence like a weight across my shoulders. The visions came more frequently. I saw him standing on a shoreline under a sky I did not recognize. I saw the castle finished, yet empty, the swans circle in the lake without rest. I saw my own reflection in a mirror, my eyes older, my face drawn, and I wondered if I had already begun to drift from the world around me. By spring, my ministers began speaking of arrangements for the governance of the realm. They did not confront me directly, but their intentions were clear. They feared my detachment, feared the expense of the castle, feared the whispers that moved through the city streets. Still, I returned to the mountains. The workers greeted me politely, though some avoided my gaze. I spent long hours in the highest tower, looking out over the valley. In the distance, the river wound through the trees, and the swans traced their slow paths along the lake. One night, as mist rolled through the gorge, I felt a presence at my side. No sound announced it, no movement in the air. I turned, expecting to find no one, yet there he stood, Paul in uniform, his face caught between shadow and moonlight. "You're not here," I said quietly. "Not yet," he replied. The vision faded before I could reach for him. I remained at the window long after, the cold seeping into my hands. Below, the swans drifted across the water, their shapes pale against the dark. The castle stood unfinished, yet in my mind I saw it completed, shining in the night. It was the only truth I felt certain I could still hold. The early summer of 1886 arrived with restless winds, carrying the scent of rain and pine from the mountains. Neuschwanstein still rose unfinished, yet its towers had begun to pierce the mist like sentinels. I visited less often now. The minister's letters had shifted in tone, no longer thinly veiled in courtesy. They spoke of duty, stability, and the protection of the realm, words chosen to mask a single intention. On the morning of June 10th they came for me. I heard the knock before sunrise, followed by voices I recognized but no longer trusted. They told me I was to be taken into care for my health. Their faces were calm, almost gentle, though their eyes betrayed urgency. I asked if Paul knew. None of them answered. They brought me to Berg Castle, its walls pressed close by the trees, its lake stretched silent beyond. Each evening I stood at the shore, the water a mirror under the dusk. Swans moved across it without haste, their shapes rippling through the reflected sky. On the third day I sensed him before I saw him, a presence at my back, quiet, patient. When I turned, he was there, Paul, not as in memory, nor as in those fleeting visions, but as if the years between had folded into nothing. His uniform hung looser than before, his hair caught by the wind. "They mean to keep you here," he said. "I know." My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "You can still leave." I shook my head. "Not in the way you mean." We walked along the water's edge, our steps slow in the damp grass. He did not speak of the past or of the minister's plans. Instead, he asked what I saw now, in this place. I told him of the visions still coming to me, though they no longer showed the future. They showed pieces of the present, moments that felt both true and impossible. The castle complete, the lake covered in mist, his hand in mine without hesitation. When I looked at him, there was a stillness in his eyes, one that felt like an answer to questions I had never dared to speak aloud. On June 13th, the rain began before sunrise. It fell in thin, steady lines, softening the edges of the trees, blurring the shore. That evening, Dr. Gooden insisted on walking with me along the lake. 2 guards followed at a distance. The rain had eased to a mist, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth. We stopped at a bend in the shore where the reeds leaned into the water. I thought of the visions again, Paul at my side, the swans circling in endless patience. I turned, expecting to see the guards, but the mist thickened, swallowing their shapes. In that quiet, Paul stepped out from the trees. His presence did not startle me. It felt inevitable, like the lake itself. "They'll write whatever suits them," he said. "They always will." I felt the weight of that truth settle in my chest. I looked at the water. It held no reflection, only depth without end. We walked into the lake together. The cold rose along my legs, then my waist. The swans moved aside, parting the water in slow arcs. Above, the sky shifted, no longer dusk, no longer day. The moment the water reached my chest, the visions came without warning. The castle stood complete, in a light that belonged to no season. Music drifted through the halls, and Paul's hand rested in mine. The ministers were gone, the corridors silent but alive with something unspoken. I did not feel the cold anymore. When the lake closed over my head, there was no struggle, only stillness. I was born too early, or far too late, but I have loved, and in that I am timeless.
Please make sure you are subscribed and be one of the strange.